Historically, as you've probably already heard this morning, there's a great deal of rivalry between the House and the Senate. But I'm happy to report to you that the history offices get along marvelously. We share a lot of projects, and we do a lot of things in tandem. And one of the things that I think both of our offices try to stress to any visitors, whether they're students or teachers or just tourists who are here coming to the Capitol, is that while the Constitution talks about this unitary thing called Congress, it really exists only on paper. In practice, there's a House and there's a Senate. And, we share a building. We sometimes swap members, but that's where the similarities end. They are separate and distinct institutions. The staff, and quite often the members, view the other body with mutual suspicion and sometimes derision. And each institution has its own unique folkways, traditions, powers, precedents, and rules of procedure. And so I thought I might talk about some of the things that make the House unique and how they've developed over time. There have been very few members in Congress who were in such a good position to understand the nuances of both chambers as Henry Clay of Kentucky. Most of our Capitol guests come here and they know about Henry Clay and his latter career, his time in the Senate as a member of the Great Triumvirate in the 1830s and 1840s during the Senate's golden era. What they do not know and appreciate so much is that he had a tremendous hand in shaping the way the institution of the House developed. In fact, the way we folks on the House side like to tell it is that after two very brief and unsatisfying stints in the Senate, he wisely left it and came to the House. He explained to James Monroe in 1810, shortly after he was elected to the House, that his time as a member of the Kentucky House of Representatives had, quote, accustomed him to the popular branch of a legislature and made him prefer the turbulence of a numerous body to the solemn stillness of the Senate chamber. And from the House's perspective, we think Clay's decision to come over was not only judicious, but again, it had far-reaching consequences for the House. And in the end, we've forgiven him for going back to the Senate eventually. This year marks the bicentennial of Clay's election, his remarkable election as Speaker of the House, November 4th, 1811. As a freshman, on his very first day, his colleagues elected him Speaker. And he was re-elected 6 times between 1811 and 1825. He is, without doubt, the 19th century's most important speaker. His magnetism and his personal charisma had a lot to do with this. He was a politician's politician. He was a world-class storyteller. He loved to play cards till the wee hours and have some drinks with the boys. And he was a great orator, make no mistake about it. And his powers of persuasion were legendary. Even those people who disagreed with him bitterly over policy and over the great issues of the day were drawn to him in an odd way. And one of these people was John Calhoun, with whom he repeatedly clashed over the slavery issue. Calhoun at one point said, "Clay's a bad man, an imposter, a creator of wicked schemes. I wouldn't speak to him, but by God, I love him." And even locked in mortal legislative combat with members of the House, Clay's wit shined. His one adversary throughout his career in the House was John Randolph, a very eccentric member from Virginia who was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee at one point, so a very powerful individual. Their relationship did not get off to a good start. Early in his speakership, Clay banished Randolph's hunting hounds from the House floor. Randolph would come in full riding gear and bring the hounds in, and members resented this, but they were too afraid to tell him to remove the dogs. Clay told the doorkeeper, "Get the beasts out of the chamber." The relationship didn't start off well, even though most of Clay's colleagues were relieved. Their rivalry extended to the clashes over the War of 1812, which Randolph did not support, and later Clay's efforts to create a compromise in 1819 and 1820 over the Missouri question. And there's a story which is probably apocryphal, but it gets at the essence of their relationship. One day, both men are walking down a long Capitol corridor towards one another, and neither one wanted to yield way. And finally, they're almost upon one another, and Randolph looks at Clay and he sneers, "I never sidestep a skunk." And Clay, without missing a beat, jumped aside and said, "I always do." But the truly revolutionary aspect of Clay's service in the House was that he presided over a transformation of the office of the Speaker. During his tenure, the speakership went from being a second-rate office that natural leaders in the House kind of shied away from, to a very desirable and powerful post. The framers had said very little in the Constitution about the office of the Speaker, except that the House shall choose their Speaker. That's it. No qualifications, no sense of structure. How's it going to work? Well, the expectation was that the Speaker would be an impartial traffic cop, a glorified parliamentarian. And this had a long and venerable history. It went back to the British House of Commons. It had a 170-year history in the colonial assemblies. It was true in the Confederation Congresses, the Continental Congresses, and also the state assemblies. The Speaker, the presiding officer, was neutral and nonpartisan. Clay broke that tradition by acting in a way 180 degrees different from his predecessors. He was partisan, and he used the Speaker's powers in concert in a manner that his predecessors, again, hadn't even imagined of. He allotted committee assignments to his allies so as to stack them with favorable votes with associates who would support his legislative agenda. When he was in the Speaker's chair, he ruled against opponents and for allies consistently, and he often, and you don't see this very often nowadays, would come out of the chair when he felt he needed to make a speech from the well of the House in behalf of legislation, and he would appoint a temporary presiding officer. His use of the speakership revealed its potential, and he maneuvered the House to support the war with Great Britain. He was able to engineer the Missouri Compromise in 1820. He pushed the American system, internal improvements, and higher tariffs to protect fledgling industry. He accomplished many things, and he also presided over an era of transformation in the House in terms of the committee system. Under Clay, the committee system became a formal standing committee system. I'll come to this a little bit later. And the size of that committee system tripled. I've spent some time talking about Clay because this story is instructive when you look at House history broadly, because it reminds us that the modern House that we see on C-SPAN every day took shape over many years, over many decades, and sometimes haltingly, sometimes in bursts, sometimes because of key individuals, often because of larger social, economic, and political forces that were at play. And it's an institution that's evolved over the years from that spare language that's in the Constitution. And it's only after the accretion of many precedents and practices over the decades that we have the modern House that we do. When you boil it down, the vast majority of the House's rhythms and folkways and traditions, I think, derive from two constitutional facts of life, constitutional designs. And this is basic civic stuff. The first is biennial elections, and the second is the proportional representation requirement. And you think about all the consequences that flow from that, and I want to talk about a few. Consider the election requirement. The father of the Constitution, James Madison, spelled out precisely the role that the founders believed the House would play in the architecture of the new federal government when he wrote that it would have, quote, an immediate dependence on and intimate sympathy with the people. And to ensure that close relationship, every 2 years, members of the House must stand for re-election. We can't appoint anyone to the House like you can in the Senate. Even in the case of a death or a resignation, members must be elected in a special election or at the next regular election. Unlike the Senate, whose members serve these 6-year terms, which seems like an eternity on the House side, and only 1/3 of whom are ever up for re-election in any 2-year cycle, The House isn't a continuing body. When it closes the final session of a Congress, it adjourns sine die, Latin for without day. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, before the 20th Amendment, it followed a cycle that reflected the agricultural society in which it was born. It organized itself typically 13 months after the regular elections. It would come in December of the following odd year after the harvest. We'd have a brief, intensive 5-month session, and we'd send members home back in May to go plant, to go run their businesses, and to get out of steamy DC. Even into the 20th century, the saying used to be, this is really up to World War II, we've interviewed folks through our oral history program, the old saying was sine die by the 4th of July. The expectation was you would get out of the city before summer set in. Congress now meets year-round, but the enduring fact is that every 2 years, every January, the House essentially reconstitutes itself. It elects a speaker, swears in the speaker swears in the membership that has arrived, it adopts a new set of rules, it elects a new slate of officers who run the place on a day-to-day basis, it frequently elects new party members. It does this on a very ritualistic day that we dub Opening Day, which is, part pep rally, part congressional pageant. The speaker in the 19th century, it was even more so a very carnivalistic day because the speaker would clear the floor of members in the 19th century and have them pack up their belongings at their desks, which in the 19th century were their DC offices. We had no office buildings. We had no staff. Everything that you owned, if you were a member, that was your DC office sitting right in front of you, 2 by 3. He would move the members back behind the bar of the House and bring a page up into the well, and the page, blindfolded, would draw numbers that had been pre-assigned to members, and that's how they would get their seat assignment on the floor. And friends and family would stand in the gallery and cheer the members on. There was a page in the 1870s who recorded this. He said, quote, "It was quite an amusing performance, and the countenances of the fortunate members beamed with the smiles of childish joy." Now, of course, we have the modern theater-style seating, which went in 1913, and there are no seat assignments except that members respect the party block tradition with Republicans sitting to the speaker's left and Democrats sitting to the speaker's right. And that party block tradition actually goes back to the 1840s when the House had met in its old chamber, which is now National Statuary Hall. Biennial elections also mean that the House historically has had a lot of turnover. In the 19th century, it was not uncommon for a Congress to have 40% or even 50% freshman members. Members typically only served 2 or 3 terms in the 19th century. They did not make a career of DC. And then we had major electoral shifts in the 19th century. In 1874, in 1890, in 1894, we had elections where the majority party went out of power because it lost 120 plus seats. In 1894, the Democrats were on the losing end of the economic turmoil of the Panic of 1893. And we had an election where the Republicans were swept into power. We had 176 freshmen. We had so many freshmen that the leadership had to tap 23 sophomores to run panels, to run committees. Think about that one for a minute. Champ Clark called it the greatest slaughter of innocents since the days of King Herod. Clark would later become the Democratic Speaker in the early 20th century. As the House professionalized in the 20th century and members began to spend their entire careers here, 20, 30, 40 years, what developed were a couple things. First of all, the incumbency rate soared, and then a system of seniority evolved, particularly in the committee system. But still, the typical turnover for the House, even in the modern era, is not inconsequential. Typically, between retirements and between electoral losses, any new Congress, we have anywhere from 45 to 60 new members. That's quite a bit of turnover. Frequent changes in that composition in the House lead not just to a new set of people, but a constantly refreshed set of priorities and agendas. And having to face elections every 2 years, representatives historically have spent a great deal of time in their districts. They devote a lot of time to constituent services, especially when they're junior members. And the House, if you had to look at both chambers, is really the more sensitive barometer of the two to political trends that are bubbling up there beyond the Beltway. As important is this requirement for proportional representation. A state's representation in the House, of course, derives from the size of its population, and members of the House represent individual districts with unique geographies, communities, peoples, businesses, and the practical result is that for much of its history, the House has been a large, diverse, rowdy, partisan, and constantly changing legislative body. When the first federal Congress convened in April of 1789 in New York City, there were 65 representatives, and the largest delegation was Virginia with 10 members. Today, the largest delegation is California, with a delegation that nearly rivals the size of that first House, 53 members. For much of its history, as the states grew, as the nation grew, the House also grew until it reached its present-day fixed number of 435 representatives. This happened in 1913. After reapportionment in the 1910 census, we added 40 seats to the chamber. We couldn't fit any more desks. We couldn't fit any more people in. And after the 1920 census, members from rural factions and from urban factions argued for the better part of the decade until they came up with a formula for apportionment in the 1929 Apportionment Act. And for the first time, it put in place a system where states would lose seats if their population shrank. Typical House districts in the 1790s had 30,000 constituents. In the modern era, it's about 750,000 people. That means a lot of people have served in the House. Roughly 11,000 people, individuals, have served in the House as representatives, resident commissioners, or delegates. And that's roughly 5 times the number that have served in the Senate. Proportional representation and the resulting size of the roster of members contributes to the House's diversity. In the early 19th century, there was an element of geographical or regional diversity. And the House floor must have seemed a fairly exotic place if you were, for instance, a representative from New England, and you were being exposed to the accents, the dress, the habits of Southerners, or folks who represented the old frontier in the old Northwest, or if you happened to be one of the earliest Hispanic members of Congress, if you were a delegate from New Mexico in the 1850s, some of whom didn't speak English and relied on their Anglo colleagues to translate for them. The House chamber must have seemed a unique place with a lot of very different people. Because the House is the part of the federal government that's closest to the people, it also has a rich history as a forum for groups that are newly admitted to the political process. And if you talk about the story of women in Congress or African Americans in Congress, it's largely a House-centric story. And I'll give you 2 examples. Joseph Rainey was our first African American to serve in the House in 1870 during the Reconstruction era. He was from South Carolina. There have been 132 African Americans who've served in Congress. 126 of them have been members of the House. And we've never had an African American who went from the House to the Senate. All the folks who served in the Senate were elected directly there. The first woman elected to Congress, who you've no doubt heard of, is Jeanette Rankin of Montana, elected in 1916, 4 years before women had the right to vote. Including Rankin, there have been 276 women who've served in Congress. 244 of those have served all or part of their careers in the House. Very House-centric story. So at this point, you might reasonably ask, how does a place this large, that's this diverse and has a changing membership, how does it function? To function as a legislative body, the House has developed centralizing forces to impose order and organization. And its rules have made it a majoritarian institution. Power has been given to the majority over the decades to allow it to work its legislative will. The House is a purposefully structured place with carefully constructed rules that give that majority power, and the minority is largely an afterthought. I discussed earlier with Clay how some of the leadership mechanisms in the Speaker's office evolved over time. I want to point out just a few more here. Formal party leadership positions developed nearly a century after the speakership developed. These developed in the late 19th and early 20th century. And here I'm talking about majority and minority leader positions and the whip system. These were created under the dominant speakerships of Thomas Brackett Reed of Maine and Joseph Cannon of Illinois at the turn of the 20th century. These were party positions that were determined by the Democratic Caucus and Republican Conference, and they weren't institutional offices that the Constitution had contemplated. But as the House organized itself and professionalized itself, they became necessary to maintain party discipline. Another distinguishing feature of the House's formal structure is its Rules Committee. Now, the Senate has a committee by the same name, roughly, Rules and Administration. But the duties of these two panels couldn't be any more different. The Senate Rules Committee assigns parking spaces, and it checks off on art and artifacts that go into the Capitol Visitor Center. The House Rules Committee structures every piece of legislation and determines its terms of debate before it ever goes to the House floor. It is an immensely powerful panel. It was formalized in 1881, and its influence has waxed and waned over the years, mostly waxed. It's comprised mostly of members from the majority party, each appointed by the Speaker. And once I had the chance to interview the longtime parliamentarian of the House, and I said, Charlie, from a parliamentary perspective, what's the number one fact of life in the House? And he, without missing a beat, he said, oh, that's easy, 9-4. And what he meant was the party ratio on the Rules Committee, which gives the majority a clear hand. In Reed and Cannon's day, the Speaker not only appointed all the Rules Committee members, he also chaired the Rules Committee, which meant that he controlled the flow of debate on the floor and he controlled what got to the floor. Now that's changed a bit. There was a revolt against Cannon in 1910, and he was stripped of his chairmanship of the Rules Committee, but the House leadership still maintains great control over who gets on the committee. Committees themselves have been another form of organizational strength in the House, and they've evolved over time. In the very earliest Congresses in the 1790s, when legislation would come to or a petition would come to the floor, the House often would create ad hoc committees. Just pick members, assign them to this bill, they would debate, they would report back to the House, and then they'd be dissolved. It was very inefficient, and no one could really develop expertise on issues. It was unwieldy, inefficient. Gradually, over a couple decades, but particularly in the 18-teens, the House began to develop this standing committee system. And if you think of some of the power committees today, Armed Services, Energy and Commerce, Judiciary, they all trace their roots back to those decades. House members, unlike senators, tend to be specialists. They serve on one or two committees, and they become experts in their fields. At some points, committees have dominated the House. After the revolt against Speaker Cannon in 1910, the speakership went into a long period of decline. And what evolved was really committee rule in the House. Power was dispersed from the speakership to the individual committee chairman. And this particularly gave many Southern Democratic chairmen who served very long terms a great deal of influence. In that era, committee chairmen were essentially chieftains. They ran their panels with impunity, they were their own little fiefdoms, and they didn't answer to anybody, not even speakers. The Rules Committee, for example, in the 1950s and 1960s, was dominated by a man named Judge Howard Smith of Virginia, who you may have heard of before, a staunch segregationist. And when civil rights legislation would come to his committee, he'd simply adjourn it. And there was one time where he claimed that his barn had burned down in rural Virginia, and he had to go back and tend to it. But everyone knew the real story. Leo Allen, who was the ranking Republican on the committee, quipped to the press, "I knew the judge was opposed to civil rights, but I didn't think he'd commit arson to beat it." Reforms in the 1970s stripped committee chairmen of their power and gave greater power to subcommittees, but committees and their leadership remain a principal nexus of power in the House. There's one other formal or really informal group of organization and power in the House that I should point out. In the House, legislative success depends on numbers and rounding up votes, your ability to get votes. So beyond the institutional modes of organization, such as leadership or committees, there are other extra-institutional groups which draw members based on the issues and based on giving members the opportunity to persuade some of their colleagues. Some of the earliest such organizations were informal groups. One of them was a group called the Chowder and Marching Club, which was formed in 1949 by House Republicans who were opposed to a veterans bill. And this was a group of young Republican Turks, and it included Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and it began to meet once a week on Wednesdays. It was very informal. There were no elected officers, there were no dues, there was no agenda. You would go to another member's office, he'd supply the drinks, and you'd sit around and talk about legislation. Sometimes there were social events and dinners. Even though it was informal, this group was exclusive and highly influential. Typically 2 or 3 members, freshmen, were tapped at the beginning of every Congress. It was a semi-secret group, not entirely secret. There have been less than 140 Chowder and Marching members since 1949. It still carries on. But the group produced numerous Republican leaders in the House and a few presidents. Democrats, too, created informal groups, much more informal. Sam Rayburn had a group that met in his office on the first floor of the Capitol called the Board of Education, where he would have some close allies among the membership, a couple of press reporters who'd come and share drinks, and occasionally a junior member of the House who they wanted to bring in and ply for his votes over bourbon and branch water. By the 1970s, the House witnessed an explosion of formal caucuses, issues caucuses. And among the first was the Congressional Black Caucus, which elected officers, it required dues, it had a formal legislative agenda. It was created in 1971. And such groups performed the function of creating voting blocks on specific legislation, and during a period of great reform ferment in the House in the 1970s, they played a role in providing leadership opportunities for junior members who weren't on the leadership rung in the institution itself. We now have more than 100 issues caucuses, ranging from the oldest, such as the wonky Democratic Study Group, to the Wine Caucus, the Arts Caucus, and one of the newest caucuses, the National Archives Caucus. Again, all modes for members to kind of develop their niche in the institution and to gain experience, leadership experience. So I hope I've pointed out a few of the unique aspects of the House. I could go on. I will say that as teachers, I would point you to the fact that as this is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and one of the things I didn't talk about was how the House kind of cyclically has influence. In the beginning, in the early republic, the House was the dominant part of the federal government. The Senate displaced it in the 1830s and 1840s. The Civil War is really a great opportunity to talk about the way Congress reasserts itself in the federal government after a number of decades kind of churning to the side over the slavery issue and the sectional issue and not having a lot of influence. Perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A session, and Don might pick up on that as well. But I'll turn the floor over. Thank you.
I have to tell you that when a member of the House is elected to the Senate, the first thing they tell him in the Senate is to forget everything you learned over on the House. So I'll begin my remarks by saying, forget everything Matt just told you. The Senate is a remarkably different place. In fact, I compare the Senate and the House to an engineering school and a liberal arts school on the same campus. They can occupy buildings right next to each other and have absolutely nothing to do with each other. They are remarkably different institutions, and they have grown differently over time. They started out with very similar rules. The rules of the House and the rules of the Senate initially were very close. But these two institutions have changed. And so what I'm going to be doing is giving some explanations for those changes. Matt mentioned that the House was the driving engine of the government at first. And that's really where the attention was. The Senate was so removed from things that it initially didn't even think it needed to do its business in public. It didn't have a gallery. It didn't open the doors. It didn't allow the public or the press in. The Constitution does not require Congress to do its work in public, just to publish from time to time a journal of its proceedings. Now, the whole Constitution had been written in secret, so it didn't require the government to operate openly. The House, of course, opened their doors on day one because they were all going to run for re-election in 2 years, and they were the only part of the federal government directly elected by the people. And so they wanted everybody to know what they were doing. The senators said, well, no, wait, we're elected by state legislatures. Some of us have 6-year terms. We're in these cycles. We're not going to be up in the next election. And if we had a gallery, all we would do is talk to the gallery. We should be talking to each other. We should be an advisory committee to the president, because we do advise and consent on the Senate side. So they met entirely in secret session for the first 6 years. In fact, if it wasn't for William Maclay, a senator from Pennsylvania who kept a diary, we really wouldn't know much of what was happening in the Senate at that period. Unfortunately, he only had a 2-year term, and we had 4 more years before they opened the doors. Well, in Philadelphia, the newspapers were really criticizing the Senate, saying this is a democracy and people should know what their government was doing. Open up, let us see. So the Senate gave in, they built a gallery, they opened it up, they invited in the press. The first day the press were there, they found the Senate so boring. They immediately went right back to the House of Representatives. And that continued on. In fact, Henry Clay gets elected to the Senate from Kentucky in 1806, and he's so ambitious that the Senate's just too quiet for him. And eventually he leaves the Senate to run for the House of Representatives. And he writes a letter to James Monroe saying, well, I have to say the reason I'm leaving is because I miss the tumult of the populist branch. I want to be over where the action is, essentially. And of course, on his very first day in the House of Representatives back in 1811, he's elected Speaker, so it was a good place for him to go. He does come back to the Senate later on, but the Senate is very different by the time he comes back. In 1805, there's a representative from New York who gets elected to the Senate. He writes a letter to his wife, and he says, henceforth you will not read of me in the gazettes because they don't cover the Senate. But that's all right because we don't have as much work to do as they do over in the House. Well, because all of this is sort of the reverse of what you'd expect. And it changed in the 1820s. It changed because of an emotional, divisive issue, the kind that the federal government and the Congress in particular, had a great deal of difficulty in dealing with, and that was the issue of slavery. At the time the Constitution was written, all of the states had slavery. By 1820, the northern states had given up slavery, and the southern states had grown more dependent on slavery. And that meant every time a new territory, and we had lots of territory, we doubled the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase, and settlers were moving west at a remarkable rate. But every time enough people got into a territory, and every time they applied for statehood, the question was, is this new state going to permit slavery or prohibit it? And there was a huge debate over Missouri. Missouri is the first territory west of the Mississippi River to apply for statehood. This was in 1819. In 1819, 1820, there's great argument, and eventually Henry Clay, as Speaker, helps to work out the compromise, which says, well, just split the difference. We'll draw this line across the country, the Missouri Compromise line. Above this line, we'll prohibit slavery. Below this line, we'll permit slavery. And every time we admit a state on one side, we'll admit a state on the other side to balance. And so Missouri is coming in as a state that permits slavery. We'll bring in Maine as a state that prohibits it. And that meant that on the single most emotional issue of the day, the U.S. Senate was roughly equal between these two sections. And eventually it began to dawn on the ambitious politicians of the day that if there was going to be a political settlement to this issue, it was going to have to be in the Senate rather than in the House. And in the House, because the North was growing in population, the North had more votes than the South did. But in the Senate, the two sides were kind of on equal footing. And so in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you see gravitating from the House to the Senate the Henry Clays, Daniel Websters, and John C. Calhouns. And they find the Senate a very comfortable environment. It's a smaller body. They can talk unlimited in the Senate, where they're already starting to put limits on the amount of time you can speak in the House. And you don't have to be bothered with going out and getting votes from the populace, because you're elected by the state legislature for longer terms, and you can come and go. Seniority was not such a big issue, so you could leave, run for president, lose, come back to the Senate, and get to be chairman of a committee no matter what. And so in the 1830s, 1840s, the Senate becomes the center of attention. It's the golden age of debate. People flock in to hear these debates. People are lining up at dawn to come hear debates in the Senate. People come from Europe. Alexis de Tocqueville, Charles Dickens, Fanny Trollope are all sitting up in the gallery to hear these great debates. And so many reporters start showing up that they want access to the floor. They're denied that. But Henry Clay in 1841 in the Senate sets aside, as a part of a compromise, 10 seats over the presiding officer's desk as the very first press gallery. That's 1841 in the Senate. The House does not get a press gallery until 1857. The White House does not get a press room until 1902, when Theodore Roosevelt is president. So the Senate becomes the center of attention at this stage. Now, what kind of an institution is the United States Senate? Matt gave you a really good overview of the House. The House is a big body, and numbers determine things in there. And he mentioned that, he mentioned California with 53 representatives, the largest single state delegation in history. I recommend you also take a look at Wyoming, which is a lovely state. It's not that far from California. It's a huge state, great amount of terrain. You can drive for hours across Wyoming without ever seeing another human being. Lots of antelope. No, not many people. About 500,000 people live in Wyoming, at least claim Wyoming for tax purposes. They probably live in Arizona and come back to Wyoming when the snow melts, which is in August usually. And so, I don't want to put down Wyoming. It's one of my favorite states, but they don't even have the 690,000 or so members of the average congressional district. But they're guaranteed one congressional seat by the Constitution. So anytime that there's an issue between California and Wyoming, water rights or whatever thing's going on, the vote in the House is going to be 53-1. And the only way Wyoming can have any kind of clout in the House is to keep re-electing their congressperson enough so that person gets to be chairman of a powerful committee, which was one reason why small states do tend to re-elect their members so frequently. But come over to the Senate. California has 2 senators. Wyoming has 2 senators. 53-1 in the House, equal in the Senate. In the Senate, there are 10 states that have half the population of the United States. They have 20 senators. The other half of the population lives in 40 states. They have 80 senators. The majority of members of the Senate represent a tiny minority, less than 20% of the population of the United States. We are not a majoritarian body by any definition. When they say, why shouldn't the majority rule? I always say, well, what majority? Which majority are you talking about in this case? Think about California and Wyoming being equal in this body. And then, of course, the Constitution requires a number of instances where we have to do more than a majority vote. There are several 2/3 requirements to overturn a veto, to ratify or to approve a treaty. And the House can impeach somebody by a simple majority vote. But for the Senate to actually throw them out of office, we need a 2/3 vote. When you calculate that, that's going to give you some indication of what the results in the Senate are going to be, because if you try to do something by party line vote in the House, it's very hard to get a bipartisan vote in the Senate on something like that. So in a number of cases, the Constitution actually requires that we have a supermajority to do any business. And then there is a little line in the Constitution. Now, the Constitution of the United States is a remarkable document. It's about 6,000 words. By comparison to the Constitution for the European Union, which is 60,000 words, and the constitutions for every state government, which is about this high, every state constitution gets down to the level of how high a curb has to be, and really minutia. The United States Constitution is a remarkable document because it can be stretched in a variety of directions to cover new issues without being amended. It's only been amended 27 times, and 11 of those amendments, including the most recent one, were written by the very first Congress before the ink on the original document was really dry. It's been amended very few times. And one reason it works and it's survived is because you can take a little phrase and make it do amazing things. And one of those phrases says, each House of Congress shall write its own rules. And that little provision has allowed the Senate and the House to reshape themselves in such a way that fits their peculiar circumstances. Matt's told you how the rules of the House are written to empower the majority, to allow the majority to get its way, because otherwise a big body like that, it would be impossible to do anything. You've got to crack heads in the House of Representatives. The only way to get anything done in the House is to have numbers, to be part of a big freshman class, like the current freshman class, to be part of a big state delegation like California, to be part of a big caucus or some other group that gets together and has the numbers to throw around. Either that or to get reelected for the next 50 years until you're chairman of a committee and then you have some individual clout. The rules of the Senate have been just the opposite. They have given much more muscle to the minority. And that's not just the minority party. It can be a minority faction within the majority party. And it can also be one single senator standing up and saying, I object. I object, and everything stops. And everybody turns around and says, why did you object? What is it you want? How can we accommodate you? And every single U.S. senator becomes an important individual player, a powerful individual player, on the moment that he or she takes the oath of office. They don't have to accrue 20 years of seniority to get that kind of power. And one reason is because of a little device that the Senate has adopted, and that they did in part by looking at the House and seeing how the House operated. Matt mentioned that the House Rules Committee has an enormous amount of influence in being able to write special rules that define the debate over every major piece of legislation. So the majority leader of the House of Representatives, when he takes a bill off the calendar, knows how long they're going to debate, when they're going to vote, how many amendments they're going to have, whether the amendments are going to be open or closed. It's defined in the rule that the House Rules Committee has written. And as Matt also pointed out, our Rules Committee deals with parking spaces and office space. Now, which all of you know, you can cut a lot of deals with parking space and office space. But they have nothing to do with what goes on the floor. So the majority leader of the Senate takes that exact same bill off the calendar, doesn't know whether or not we're going to vote on it today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, or ever. Doesn't know how many amendments we're going to have on it, either whether the amendments are going to have anything to do with the bill. Amendments have to be germane in the House of Representatives. They have to be relevant to the bill. You can have an amendment on anything you want in the United States Senate, which is a wonderful way of getting things passed in the Senate. In the 1950s, we had a remarkable majority leader by the name of Lyndon Johnson. And if you read any one book about the Senate, I would highly recommend Robert Caro's Master of the Senate. It's a big, thick book, but it reads like a novel. And Caro's really he's captured Johnson coming in and trying to deal with this institution. It starts with a 100-page essay on the history of the Senate. And people ask me, well, why did he do this? This is a biography of Johnson. Why does he go back and talk about Henry Clay and Daniel Webster? And I said, well, it's sort of a St. George and the Dragon story. And first he had to introduce the dragon. He had to introduce the monster that was literally devouring majority leaders. Two of Johnson's immediate predecessors had been defeated for re-election. The Senate was stalemated. Johnson, who was a protege of Sam Rayburn's in the House of Representatives, comes over to the Senate, and he tries to figure out how to make the Senate a little more efficient along the lines of the House of Representatives. And what he does is he takes a little device known as the unanimous consent agreement, which had been used for just little housekeeping things, essentially, up to that point. And for instance, I've got this 30-page speech, and I'm about 20 pages into it. I'm getting a little dry, and I'm thinking I'd rather do something else. And I say, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the rest of my speech be inserted in the record as if read. Without objection, so ordered. Nobody wants to hear the rest of my speech there. Delighted to see me go. Everybody's satisfied. And in next day's record, it looks like I stood up there and read every word in the whole thing. That was what unanimous consent agreements were like. Well, Johnson says, they have these rules, special rules in the House. We could use the unanimous consent agreement for the same thing. For instance, most people who are particularly interested in a certain type of legislation are on the committee dealing with that legislation. Both sides have had a chance to hammer it out, put amendments into it and everything else. They agree on 9/10 of that legislation. There's just 1/10 of it there's still some disagreement on. So why don't we have a unanimous consent agreement that we accept the 9/10? We don't bother redebating that and amending it and arguing it. And we're just going to limit ourselves to the part of the bill that we disagree with. And we'll have 4 amendments on each side can introduce 2 amendments. And maybe we could limit the amount of time and we could agree on voting so we could go out for dinner tonight. It's whatever everybody could live with. Without objection, so ordered. Great. That has now facilitated the debate in the Senate the way a rule would facilitate the debate in the House. But there are some instances where absolutely nobody else in the Senate cares enough about this bill to have an amendment to it. They have worked it out in the committee. Everybody's happy with what the committee bill is. Why bother having a debate on this issue? Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 137 be adopted. Without objection, so ordered. What just happened? The whole bill just passed. Without any debate on it, without any vote on it, without anybody re-recorded one way or the other and anything on this thing. The Senate does the majority of its business by unanimous consent. We think of this as a terribly divisive body where they can't agree with each other on anything. But in fact, of the matter is the majority of the things they do, they're 100% agreement with each other. It's just the part that they disagree with that they go out and they act really viciously on the floor about. Now, unanimous consent has really enabled Senate majority leaders to get things done. But unanimous means unanimous. It means the greenest person who just took the oath can object just as much as the senior member of the majority party. And they do a lot. Some of them like to object to things. And they don't even have to object. They can just put a hold on something. And a hold is just a signal to the leader that if you try to bring this up by unanimous consent, I will object. And leaders don't want to be blindsided on the floor, so they're glad to know. They're not happy about it, but they're glad at least to have that information so they can figure out the schedule and they can sort of steer around to things that there's nothing controversial about. Now, an objection to a unanimous consent agreement is not necessarily designed to kill the bill altogether. Sometimes you just want time to read the bill. It's 2,000 pages, it's just come on the floor. You're interested in the issue, you want to take a look through it, make sure they're not slipping something in that you don't know about. That's true. Sometimes you want the nominee to come around and talk to you personally. Your senior senator from your state has got that name into the president, but you want that person to come and grovel to you a little bit before they go out into the world. Sometimes it's because you've got this amendment that you really want to get up there on the bill. Sometimes it's because that darn agency has not been listening to you and you want it to change its policy, and by gosh, you're going to have a hold on every single nominee they have coming up until they change that policy. Senators like to throw their weight around on some of these issues. That's what they get elected for along the way. And they can in a way that individual House members really can't, which is the reason why 50% of the United States Senate is made up of former House members. And 0% of the House is made up of former senators. Occasionally a senator will go to the House, John Quincy Adams, Claude Pepper, but they are the exceptions to the rule. Now the salary is the same. You earn just as much in the House as you do in the Senate. And in fact, if your district has been sufficiently gerrymandered, you've got much more job security in the House, even though you have to run a lot more frequently, than you do in the Senate where you run statewide every 6 years. So why give up that security? Sam Rayburn used to say, you're already in Washington. Why bother running for the Senate? But it's because of that individual power that senators get and because of the way the Senate does business. And of course, the Senate also has the filibuster. And you've all seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, I hope. It's the best altogether movie about Washington. Please try to forget most of what you saw in that movie because that's not the way filibusters really are conducted anymore. It's great, it's very dramatic and all the rest of it, but you just won't see Jimmy Stewart collapsing on the floor in the Senate chamber. For the most part, you can have a filibuster in the Senate just by saying, I object. And you can have a filibuster in the Senate by voting against a cloture motion. that would enable you to cut off filibusters. There's lots of ways in which the minority, it can be the minority party. Again, it could be a minority faction within the majority party, the way the Southern Democrats filibustered against civil rights legislation that was being promoted by the Northern Democrats and by Republicans at that time. And it can be, again, about a single individual. Well, it's a very strange system if you look at most Western democracies. In most Western democracies, power is in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister is in the House of Commons. The former Prime Minister is in the House of Lords reading the newspaper. In most branches of most democracies, they have taken away power from the upper house. I was in the Czech Republic recently. They have a House and a Senate. If their House passes a bill, it goes to the Senate. The Senate has 30 days to respond. If the Senate does not respond in that 30 days, the House can pass it again, and it becomes law without the Senate having anything to do with it. Can you imagine the United States Senate having to operate on a 30-day timetable after the House has operated? But I point out to people that if the authors of our Constitution had wanted an efficient government, they would never have created the United States Senate in the first place. They created the Senate as a second house to have second thoughts. And they created a complex system to get bills through because they wanted essentially bills to be really vetted out. The second house acts in a sense as a court of appeals. Anybody who's got a problem with the bill as passed in the first house goes to the second house. It could be either one. To say, look, this is what's wrong with this bill. And in the end, you come up with legislation that creates a national consensus on controversial issues. We are a very large, very diverse nation with lots of different economic issues and ethnic issues and every other ideological issues. The role of the Congress is to be the ground, a common ground for people to argue those issues and to come up with some sort of a compromise, find some sort of common ground. And sometimes Congress can do that, sometimes they can't. But on the other hand, the congressional system has operated in remarkably similar ways for the last 220 some odd years.